starting off with those foundations, the 6, Rory, necessary and sufficient conditions for therapeutic change. And I noticed, Rory, that you didn't say we're going to chat about the core conditions.
No, because we're not going to chat about the core conditions. We're going to talk about the 6 necessary and sufficient conditions for therapeutic change. And of course, what we're talking about is part of what I've named the Trinity of Rogers' theories. That it's 3 legs that hold the tabletop up. We've got, in 1951, he talks about the 19 propositions. In 1961, he talks about the 7 stages of the process. And in 1957, not quite a halfway point, but, roughly halfway for the purpose of this discussion, he published the 6 necessary and sufficient conditions in the Journal of Consulting Psychology about 5 years after he'd stood on the podium at Chicago with Otto Rank, who was talking about will therapy. And it separated Rogers from the rest of the pack. In 61, he published his theory of personality, which laid a line in the sand and began the third force in psychology, which was, of course, humanism. And to back that up, his theory of personality was based in perception, the world of phenomenology. Then when he came to thinking about therapy, he published 6 conditions, not 3, 6 necessary and sufficient conditions. And just to remind us, Ken, of those conditions, the first one was psychological contact, that the client and the counsellor share what Fritz Perls would refer to as equal and present time. In other words, that they were both roughly in the same space of perception, if we think about psychological contact, if you're dealing with someone who may be very seriously ill with psychosis, or maybe under the influence of, medication or alcohol, you're not going to get that connection. And that psychological contact is important. Then he talks about client incongruence. Client needs to have something to bring. Client needs to have something to bring to therapy. And then we talk about really the first of the core conditions, which is client-counsellor congruent, very real, very present. For the client receives empathy from the counsellor. In other words, at some level, the client buys in and understands that person's trying to help. Number 5 is the counsellor shows unconditional positive regard, is non-judgmental. And number 6, the client perceives and accepts the unconditional positive regard. And go on, Ken, ask me why do I call the core conditions?
Rory, so often when we're kind of thinking about these conditions, we say the core conditions. When was it, can you explain, please, pray tell, Rory, that Carl Rogers mentioned the term core conditions?
Well, he didn't. Carl Rogers didn't mention the core conditions at all. He mentioned the facilitative conditions, but he never mentioned the core conditions. That is down to someone called Robert Karkoff. And for those of you who are doing skills, you may know the Karkoff and Truax inventory, where you can map empathic and congruent responses. And Robert Karkoff was a social worker. And I think what we have to think about and remember is that at the time Rogers was developing this theory, majority of this type of work was carried out by social workers. Remember, he worked with Jesse Taft at the Rochester Children's Society. Taft who translated Otto Rank's work from the German into English, and in fact introduced Otto Rank to Rogers. And Karkoff was a social worker, and this is the bit that sends a shiver up my spine when I talk about this, Ken, is that what Karkoff did is he took 3 conditions that could be used anywhere else other than therapy. He took empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard. It formed the basis of modern social work practice. It formed and permeated into education, certainly here in the UK. And the legacy of that is that if you look at any adverts for, be it healthcare, personal care, anything in the social care, they'll always talk about client-centered or person-centered.
Yep.
And that really is down to Kharkov skimming those conditions off and thinking we can apply those to something else. Because, you know, if you're a teacher, psychological contacts, client incongruence, and client perceiving and accepting unconditional positive regard really aren't, it's really not in the remit of teaching or social work. So the impact, you know, dropping that pebble into the pool, the ripples are massive, and they still resonate today, all the way through history from 1957. It's incredible.
It is incredible. It's incredible that those ripples, what they have created, and the change and the difference that has made. And I think that I'm so glad that we were able to focus in on core conditions versus 6 necessary and sufficient conditions. Rogers said there are 6 conditions. They are necessary. In other words, they have to be there for this psychological contact and for the process to play out. And he also says they are sufficient. That is all we need. Yeah. Those 6 necessary and sufficient, not 3. 3, we're working with half of them. And of course, they're powerful. Empathy, congruence, UPR. They are so powerful. But they only make sense when we look at all 6 of them together. So as you said, Rory, we talk about the facilitative conditions rather than core conditions, if we're speaking in the language of Rogers, facilitating the relationship. And of course, the other 3 are based within the client. So if we take them one by one and we talk about psychological contact between counsellor and client, you've already mentioned what that might look like, Rory, and what might impair that, such as being under the influence and the client not being able to fully engage in therapy. Well, that would break psychological contact. And if we look at Rogers' theory, he says if that is broken, then the rest of the relationship falls down. They are all necessary to be there. And they are sufficient if they're there. In all 6 of them are there. There's the word stumbling again, Rory. So another thing with psychological contact we might look at is if somebody is sent for counselling, they don't think they need counselling. They're going in and they sit down in front of you and you say, well, what is it you want to bring? And they go, well, nothing really. I've been told I need to come in here by my work, by, I don't know, my teacher, wherever you might be working. Then the question is there psychological contact? Is that client there for the reason of being present, being engaged in the relationship, or are they going to be standing slightly outside of the relationship with their arms crossed watching you work? You're not going to break through there because the person is not there's no connection. That psychological contact. I'm here for this process and I'm engaged in it with you. So there's that psychological contact. Then it speaks about the client is incongruent. Now, when we look at the facilitative conditions, we are told congruence is really important. And congruence, what is that? This is from the point of view of you, the therapist. Congruence is what you feel inside is shown outside. It is a transparency of you as a person within that relationship. You're not playing the part of a therapist. You're really being you in that human-to-human interaction. And you're being 100% truthful with what you say and how you act and your way of being within the relationship. So that's the congruent side of the facilitative condition. But within Rogers' theory, he says the client is incongruent. And of course, the client is incongruent. What they're feeling inside is not what is represented outside. And that is what causes the pain. And that is what brings them to see you in the first place. They come in going, I'm feeling like this, but I shouldn't. In other words, they're inside, it feels like this, but I shouldn't feel like that. Therefore, there is incongruence. I'm feeling like this and I don't know how to make that go away. It's affecting my life. There is an incongruence. So the person coming into therapy, if there was no incongruence, if they were completely accepting of who they are and how they are, they wouldn't be presenting in therapy in the first place. So they need to have that level of incongruence, Rory. Yes, go jump in.
You're absolutely right, Ken. You're absolutely right. And I think, and if you're a student listening to this, pens out. I'm going to drop a truth bombshell here. There's 3 client conditions, and they're congruence, empathy, and unconditional positive regard. Those are important to the client, but the other 3 conditions are actually, pens poised, they are for assessment. And it allows the therapist to make an ethical and realistic assessment of can therapy take place. If you have someone who isn't in psychological contact with you, then really you're not going to get very far. If the client hasn't got anything to bring, maybe, and we think about coming to the end of therapy where people are just coming maybe sometimes for a chat and actually no work's being done, then there's no therapy taking place. And also, and I think this is the really important one, client perceives acceptance and unconditional positive regard from the counsellor. And that's about the relationship. And that is a great, when we think of assessment tools, we think of ticking boxes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, good, bad, excellent. But actually assessment here is phenomenological. It means that the therapist has to make a call on, is the relationship functioning enough for the other conditions to work, or at least the core conditions. And if it can't, then obviously some reparative work or a conversation about, am I the right therapist for you? He covered all the bases, Rogers.
He did, and that you've just mentioned there, that's the final one that I wanted to dive into, and that is the client perceives acceptance and unconditional positive regard. So if we go to the facilitative conditions, we as the counsellor are using our way of being to show empathy, to try and understand it from the client's perspective, and we are working to be non-judgmental within that relationship, no matter where they are, what they've done. We're not judging that; we're just being with them. However, we look at the 6th necessary and sufficient condition, which says if the client doesn't perceive that from us, if it's not there, if they don't get it, then it is not effective therapy. So an example of ineffective unconditional positive regard and empathy is like this. If you're watching a film and that film has got a touching moment in it, you may feel a level of empathy. You may feel for the person, the character that is being portrayed in the film. So you are expressing empathy. You're feeling that emotion within, but the person in the film has no idea that you're feeling that empathy. They don't know because they're on a film. So within a client relationship, we feel the empathy. It comes up within us and we're showing that unconditional positive regard. But unless we are expressing ourselves in such a way that the client goes, I'm being heard. This person gets me. This person understands me. This person accepts me for how I am. Then we're not hitting that number 6. Client perceives acceptance and unconditional positive regard. It brings it together. Taking 3 of the conditions and standing them alone, I think it makes them lonely because they need to be with their 3 pairs. 3 pairs. What am I talking about? Pairs or twos? They need to be all 6 together.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I love the way you've outlined the sixth condition. And it may be that some people are listening to this and thinking, well, I've only been taught 3 conditions in my training, and I guess if you're doing UK certificate, which would be level 3 in England and level 4 or 5, I think, for our friends in Scotland. You would only be taught 3, and the reason is that a certificate in counselling skills can be used in a multitude of work. You could use it as a helper, you could use it as a support worker, and understanding those is really, really important. It's only when you go into actual counselling training that the other conditions are revealed. But I do think that there is an overemphasis on what's called the core conditions. And, I think that anybody who's training to be a therapist, or anybody is a therapist, have a look at those hidden conditions, those conditions that really are the therapist conditions, and sit and think about, how can I use those within the relationship? How can I develop a better understanding of them, or a more nuanced understanding? Because those are the things that bind the relationship. And we know from the research, it's the relationship that is one of the biggest factors of therapeutic change.